Please, allow me. It will be easier.
Whoa, what are you doing?
Our minds, one and together.
The Twilight Zone originally premiered in 1959 and stayed on air for 5 years, giving us 156 different episodes. Within those 156 unique stories are some of the most influential writing that is seen throughout media today. It's hard to even describe how broad and diverse of an impact this show had on Hollywood. One example of its legacy is the fact that it still runs in syndication on the Sci-Fi channel. It left a big mark on culture that forever changed the landscape of television. While there have been multiple revivals of the show, the original series has always been the peak of its quality. The Twilight Zone balances many genres, but it specifically took science fiction, a not very well-known subject in the world of the 50s, and brought it to popularity.
This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone's basic plot is about ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary situations. Each episode being self-contained, there was a basic structure behind the show to have a beginning and an end to every episode. They were narrated by Rod Serling, who would break the fourth wall and give a brief synopsis of the current storyline. Serling was the creator of the Twilight Zone and the mastermind behind the concept, writing nearly 2/3 of the entire series. He's ranked number 1 of TV Guide's 25 Greatest Sci-Fi Legends, and is one of the main people everyone should thank for the success of the film genre today. While science fiction's roots can be traced back to Anno Domini, and its ideas passed on through inspiration from writer to writer, early pulp fiction works of sci-fi, and even shows like Science Fiction Theater or Tales of Tomorrow generally weren't mainstream. Serling drew inspiration from the groundwork laid before him, and his writing talent made it easily digestible by anyone. Like the genre's emergence wrought by the Industrial Revolution, the Twilight Zone was actually born from a resistance to corporate censorship. TV back then was just family-friendly entertainment that anyone could enjoy, and everything was held up to a certain standard of decorum. But that changed at the end of the 50s and start of the 60s, when social unrest, plus the presidential election, made producers start to look at television more as a podium to express ideas. Serling felt the only way to avoid artistic interference was to create his own TV show, and the focus of science fiction made him get away with commentary on the harsh realities of the 1950s. Serling was a smart man, and for the rights of all people, so it makes sense he would create sci-fi with themes of social issues.
Any state, any entity, any ideology that fails to recognize the worth, the dignity, the rights of man, that state is obsolete.
While Serling claimed he would not use his scripts as vehicles of social criticism, his show quite clearly had themes of racism, socio-political issues, and war. The Twilight Zone initially had a hard time getting off the ground. Few critics thought a show about robots, aliens, or time travel could transcend empty escapism, but when it premiered, The Twilight Zone was met with critical acclaim and success, introducing many Americans to common science fiction tropes.
What's going on here anyway? Where am I?
Oh, there's a sign.
Twilight Zone.
The focus on making captivating stories with thought-provoking resolutions brought the twist ending to more light, which is heavily used in movies today. But the best contribution this show made was elevating the status of the genre. Science fiction used to be synonymous with stuff like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, which was basic-level entertainment. Although with Serling's writing addressing serious topics, the end product is sci-fi weaved with themes of societal problems into great stories. Now so many movies and TV shows you see in the genre base many of their stories on philosophy and existential subject matter. Black Mirror, Ex Machina, and Westworld have some of the best plots in science fiction today, basing their stories on concepts of individualism, social commentary, and tech anxiety. The reason why I think this show is so great is because it was a mix of genres, not only sci-fi, it also gave us some of the best horror and fantasy storylines. My personal favorite episode, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, is a mix of both science fiction and horror. It dives deep into human nature and how paranoia affects the mind. If you haven't seen this episode, I would highly recommend you check it out before I spoil it. It's up to you, but you can skip to the time if you haven't seen it. One afternoon, the residents of Maple Street hear a loud noise and see a flash of light in the sky. They They think nothing of it until a power outage occurs and a neighbor boy tells them about a story he read of an alien invasion where they first sent down scouts to live amongst humans in disguise. After accusations that one of them is an alien, they all descend into madness, resorting to mob mentality and end up attacking one another. In the end, it turns out the alien invasion was real, but they were just using a device to alter the neighborhood's power. The aliens make a comment on how simply fiddling with consistency causes humans to panic, and how this is a pattern that can be exploited. Their plan is to simply use this strategy to conquer Earth, one neighborhood at a time. This is still one of my all-time favorite pieces of science fiction, because with all the knowledge humans have today, we can still be exploited by fear tactics. And this is just one example of a show completely filled with tales of equal caliber. The Twilight Zone ushered in the world of the 60s, where you saw a boom of good science fiction films that started to take the genre seriously. 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick, came out only 4 years after The Twilight Zone ended. It was a moment in history when humans started to take more experimental ways of expressing themselves through media, pushing the envelope of what could be shown in theaters and on TV. Then only a decade later, films came out, taking even more steps onto something bigger and better. The Twilight Zone paved the way for many things, most notably Star Trek's original series. Many of its actors got their start on the show, demonstrating their ability to act in the science fiction genre. The self-contained episode structure allowed many actors to be on the show, including William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, James Doohan, and George Takei. Many of the writers and directors that worked for The Twilight Zone ended up working for Star Trek. Plenty of movies and TV shows use ideas in their inception that can be traced back to The Twilight Zone, because it really is an amalgamation of genre bending. Just to list a few examples, Little Girl Lost is about a married couple who find their daughter vanished but can still hear her cries. It bears resemblance to Poltergeist. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is about a man who escapes from a hanging and travels back home, only to realize it was all an illusion at the moment of being hung. This clearly has some of the same themes as The Sixth Sense. And finally 22, in which a woman has premonitions of her own death, eerily close to the same plot as Final Destination. It's amazing that a show from the 60s beats a lot of media today in terms of quality. It seems like writers and producers forget what basic things make a story great. Even with a low budget, no CGI, and using sets as locations, The Twilight Zone is one of the greatest TV shows of all time. It proves why less is more, and is why I return to it rather than a Star Trek Discovery or Picard. The only down point of the show is really just personal preference, because classic media can be hard to get into. But this program is an outlier for me, and is the only vintage TV show I've never felt boredom enough to switch to something else while it's playing. Every time you start an episode, it fills you with the feeling that you're going to see something interesting and thought-provoking, only further propelled by Rod Serling's majestic voice. Serling, without a doubt, is one of the greatest writers of all time. He was able to get concepts to air that would have immediately got rejected back then. His show was really a cautionary tale of society's problems that sadly are still around today, haunting the current generation. I don't think it was solely Serling or his creation that caused the boom of good science fiction, but without a doubt it was the turning point that has led the evolution of the genre up to the current day. Sadly, he passed away at an early age of 50, but his stories will forever live on. There's a reason why the show has had such a long-lasting legacy. Only the greatest TV shows of all time can last more than half a century and not fade into irrelevance. Everyone I have introduced to The Twilight Zone has immediately ended up a fan, so if you have a deep appreciation of sci-fi, or just want to see a good example of its roots, I would 100% say the show is a good starting point.